Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. It's a great pleasure today to sit with Andrew Fox from the Henry Jackson Society in the UK. Andrew is no stranger to war, having completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, and most recently coming back from a trip to Israel, wherein, Andrew, you were in Gaza. And I'd love to hear your reactions about what that trip was like. What can you share with us?
Well, it was certainly an opportunity that I couldn't pass up. I was lucky enough to meet one of the senior leaders from Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in London last week, and that was rapidly followed up by a request from me if I could perhaps go visit them, and then an acceptance. So I literally caught the same day flight to Israel, and on Monday I went into the Gaza Strip. We went to Secure Distribution Site 3, which is in the Rafah area of Gaza. And what I'll try and do is walk you through what I saw from the process start to finish, and then we can talk about perhaps the tactical and operational and maybe even strategic considerations that come from it. But when you drive through Rafah, be under no illusion that the place is just rubble. I don't think there was a single building left standing on the way in, like not one. Like just piles of rubble at the side, and then roads have been bulldozed to create a pathway for the vehicles that we were using. Uh, the way the GHF works is the convoys go through. They have armed protection, so they've had none of their convoys um, looted or intercepted. Not a single one. And you compare that to the UN's figure that they've just released, which is 85% of theirs have been interfered with in some way. So it shows you that protecting convoys in Gaza does work if you want to make sure the aid gets to the people who need it. The distribution side itself is essentially a four-sided kind of square. It's with big sand walls that have just been bulldozed in place. It's split in half, and the front half is where the food is laid out. The aid is just the boxes are all laid out by the local Palestinians that are employed there. On the other side is where the American contractors wait whilst the aid distribution goes on, and they only go forward when they're needed to help with some sort of gentle crowd control. Um, the crowds are held back before being allowed in. This is where most of the controversy comes from. The IDF are using live fire rounds to do crowd control. And, there is a situation where thousands of effectively enemy civilians are allowed behind front lines. And I think that makes the IDF guys on the ground quite twitchy. If the Gazans stray off the designated pathways, or if they approach IDF positions, that's when then soldiers have opened fire and perhaps been a little bit too hasty in doing so, I think we can say. But once the crowd are allowed, they flood forward, a huge wave of humanity. I've never seen anything quite like it. They swarm over the boxes and start, taking what they want. They start, trading food with each other, and it is chaotic, and it is mostly young men, certainly at the start, and they were quite, you know, they were quite happy to be aggressive with one another. I saw a lot of long knives. Some of them are used for cutting open boxes of aid, but some have been used to stab each other as well. Um, Towards the end of the distribution, there were more women, children, and elderly, and GHF had actually held back 5% of the aid. So they let the men clear the aid that was there. They pushed the aid, they pushed the civilians off the site and just kept the women and children behind. They did use smoke grenades. They did use flashbangs, both non-lethal, both things I've used multiple times in my career. They're not harmful, unless you're unlucky enough to kind of have one land on you. But that's easily avoided. And then they fed the women and children, and there was a really, actually, very nice atmosphere. You could see a real rapport between the American operators and the civilians. That some of them they were starting to recognise after repeat visits. The little kids were smiling and dancing. The GHF crew were giving out medical aid, bandaging wounds and injuries, and just trying to do what they could for the people of Gaza. Um, and yeah, and then once that was done, they all left, and that was the end of the distribution session. It was chaos. It was organised chaos. They've obviously had teething problems, but I think a lot of those are starting to get resolved now. And it seems to me a good system, but just not big enough to feed the whole of Gaza. There's 400 distribution sites that the UN and other agencies have been using. The GHF is just 4. So it's clearly something that can't just feed Gaza on its own, and does need scaling up over time if this is to be an enduring solution.
Now, talk to me about the live fire that you mentioned. Do you think that there's an alternate to live fire? Based on the kind of the feeling that was there and what you saw on the ground, did it seem like the soldiers were at risk and therefore, really, as a protective measure, required to do that?
Yeah, it's something I'm still not quite comfortable with, and I don't have the conclusive answer for this one. They were certainly using machine guns and snipers. I could hear both being fired prior to the distribution. There were no reports of casualties, though. That's probably worth saying. So that clearly implies that the IDF were using it for warning shots rather than shooting at civilians. The GHF contractors I spoke to, the blokes on the ground, they were adamant that the Gaza Health Ministry numbers were nonsense in terms of the numbers of civilians killed at the sites. They say they've had none at any GHF sites, not one. Um, they've only used live fire a couple of times themselves and firing into the air to clear people out, but they've not seen a single fatality at their sites, and that's something they're really keen to put across. Um, what else can you do? I think perhaps a better route would be something. It's a very long route. I've got a map I can share with you if you want to use it for the broadcast, but it is a long old way for the civilians to go to get there. If they do stray from the route, that's when fire is used to get them back onto it. I don't like it as a technique, but like you say, what's the alternative? And so perhaps a bit more thought needs to go into that to make sure that nobody's getting shot on the way to collect food. But then, of course, there is Hamas deliberately trying to stoke fire. They're deliberately pushing people off the route to try and get them shot. And there's indications that they themselves have fired inside the crowds to try and cause a stampede, to try and create the problems that we're seeing. So it's a complex and difficult situation, and there's never an easy answer to such things. Um, but I'm sure it's something they will keep trying to find a way through.
Now, there's been a lot of criticism that the Gazan people have to walk. They have to get themselves to these sites. And that alone is not efficient. It's not safe. There's a better way of doing it. So you went into Gaza. You drove through. You saw what the rest of Gaza looks like. Um, is there a better system that Israel that has just not thought of?
Well, I think there is sort of, if not better, certainly complementary, and they have thought of it and they're doing it. So it's called the Community Distribution Scheme, where they've had applications from sort of 300 family leaders, tribal leaders, clan leaders, whatever you want to call them, where they're being vetted as we speak. Um, and the idea is that these leaders will come to the distribution sites themselves, take the aid, and then distribute it to their own people, sort of back where they're living, which seems to me to be an eminently sensible way to expand the ability and the reach of the GHF system. Um, but as you say, security is all here. This is the most important thing: is the security, and so the aid doesn't get hijacked and doesn't end up in Hamas's hands. And having it behind the front lines in Rafah and in the south of the Strip does make sense. There's no way Hamas can openly get in there. We know there's no tunnels they can suddenly pop out of and start attacking distribution sites. So for the safety of everyone involved, that's where it has to be. As you say, they do have to walk a very long way to get there, and there were some pretty heartrending scenes of young boys trying to lift these huge sacks of aid that was clearly not going to be possible for them to carry for miles at a time. So anything we can do to shorten that makes sense, and the community distribution makes is probably the perfect way to do that.
Okay, and while you were there, did you see anything else other than the humanitarian aid component in terms of being able to assess the overall picture of how the IDF is operating in Gaza or any of the tactics Hamas in general is engaged in right now?
No, we didn't. It was the secure part of the south of Gaza, so it was as secure for me as it was for anyone else. Which means we weren't near the fighting, we weren't near the combat troops, and the only IDF I saw were the kind of reservists who are protecting the depth positions on those sites. So I don't have any real detail on that.
Okay, so in terms of your experience in previous combat zones, and anything you can share with us, not based on this specific trip, but just your overall sentiments of how the war is progressing in Gaza.
I mean, I still think that Israel is fighting the most complicated war that certainly is in living memory. The scale of the challenge that Israel is continuing to take on is huge, because you have obviously the well documented challenges of the terrain, where you have a 360-degree battle above ground, below ground, the subterranean Gaza, um, complicated by a human shield strategy that is far beyond just normal guerrilla tactics. I put out a paper on that human shield strategy with Enemy Jackson Society, and some of the kind of pushback on that was, oh, this is just what guerrilla forces do, and it's like, no, this is unprecedented in military history. Nobody has ever deliberately tried to get their own civilians killed so they can have a PR victory, and I don't think this has been properly explained in the West, if I'm honest, and I don't think it's broadly understood. And that leads me on to kind of the second element here. So it's militarily a really tough fight, but also on the information space, on the battlefield of the world's media, um, it's been a horror show. The international press just print and repeat lies. They retract them. But by then, the damage is done, and we've seen that just this last week with the New York Times and various newspapers in the UK using images of a child with cerebral palsy and claiming that it's starvation. Um, and yet, that narrative and that traction is the dominant one, and people genuinely think this is like an African famine, which clearly it's not. There aren't hundreds of thousands of children with ribs like xylophones dying of hunger. It's just not. It's just not true. And yet, ask anyone on the street, and that is the perception. So there are these two wars that Israel's had to fight. One is grinding along. It hasn't achieved its goals yet. I think there's a legitimate question to ask is whether those goals are achievable. But the second part here is this international information war, which has been an absolutely one-sided battering. And I don't have a solution to how we fix that going forward. It makes things incredibly challenging, and it's led us directly to all these European leaders trying to recognise the state of Palestine.
So you spend some time in Gaza, you come back to England, and do you think your voice will be heard when you speak to the media, when you share your experience, or what you're saying, that those lies, that manipulation of the truth is just so pervasive that even your first person account can't counter all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think once the narrative is set, they're not really interested in anyone that goes against it. You kind of get painted into a corner as someone who's a bit strange for having a different opinion. But what can you do? I mean, I can keep talking about it. I can keep doing interviews. I've done a number of interviews around the world with the world's media. But interestingly enough, I did British Forces broadcasting service yesterday, and it was by far and away the most sort of aggressively everyone in Gaza is starving interview I've done. It was, and this is the Armed Forces news channel. So the narrative is so laid down that I think it's incredibly difficult to turn that oil tanker once the direction is set. And I think perhaps that is a huge lesson for all of us in the West when we're fighting these kind of conflicts, is that people are very easily manipulated in the age of social media.
The Prime Minister of the UK has announced that the UK is going to recognize a Palestinian state in September. France, Canada, more and more countries are regressing to the concept of a Palestinian state, which has never worked in Israel.
Yeah, it's
How do
it's
we
it's
communicate to them?
yeah. I mean, it's all a bit strange, and I think they're talking to domestic audiences rather than to Palestinians or Israelis. Um, if you look at the conditions that are put on it, the the UK are trying to effectively blackmail Israel by saying you have to unilaterally cease fire or we'll do it, which of course immediately gives Hamas every reason not to come to a ceasefire. So they're actually prolonging the war with this kind of naive approach. If you look at the Canadian conditions, on the condition that you have elections and that you don't elect Hamas, it's like, well, Hamas is running at 70% approval rating in the West Bank. On the one hand, you're telling Palestinians that you want an election, and on the other hand, you're telling them who they can and can't vote for. It's a very condescending and colonial way of approaching this. It's very 1940s in some ways, um, and frankly, I find it embarrassing and amateurish on the part of certainly the UK's politicians. They simply don't understand this situation. There is a fingertip deep understanding of the complexity of this issue, and a real arrogance in presuming that the UK can boss countries around and draw lines on maps in the Middle East. I think those days are over, frankly. So it's it's enraging to watch, but I don't think it will practically achieve anything in the long run. They recognise the state of Palestine. So what? What comes from it? Nothing. Um, but it does, I think, point to the more wider diplomatic isolation that Israel is going to face as a result of the information warfare that I was talking about just a minute ago.
You would think, you would hope that the world has learned, already back in 1948, the UK set the stage for a two-state solution and it failed. And it's as if history is just repeating itself once again. Is there anything else you'd like to share I haven't asked you?
No, not really. I thought it was interesting talking to my Israeli friends. I think the there's still that wildly differing public opinion in Israel. It goes everything from we should ceasefire yesterday to we should go through and occupy the place completely. And it's fascinating to see those conversations playing out in real time. And it's a really good illustration, I think, of the severity of how having 50 hostages still in Gaza is affecting every element of political life in many ways. That's what it seems like to me as an outsider. Um, and I think any solution that doesn't put those hostages, you know, back on the way to Israel, I think is short-sighted and weak. And that's probably my biggest objection, above all of the sort of colonial arrogance of Western countries. The fact that they are seemingly kind of sidelining the hostages and rewarding Hamas for taking them is a particularly bitter pill to swallow as someone who's tracked this conflict for the last 21 months and knows the dynamics intimately.
So, you mentioned the hostages. What is your sense about the way the Israeli army is operating in terms of not risking the life of these hostages and at the same time prolonging the war because of those certain areas that are so sensitive to operate in? Do you see
Yes,
another option? What is your sense of that?
the Dere Balach and Central Camps battalions and all those have had a relatively free ride during the war because of the presumed location of the hostages. Um, at the moment, if Hamas will not negotiate, and they won't, they've turned down deal after deal after deal. You have to look at another way to do this, I think. And there's really one option militarily that stands out, and that is to seize terrain and hold it, and then trade it for hostages. And I think that's probably the only real military option that will work. I don't think hostage rescue raids will work. I don't think just continually killing Hamas on a daily basis will work. And my other concern, of course, is that even Hamas don't have centralized control over where the hostages are. They've had a huge attrition of their senior leadership. Um, and I don't have any concrete evidence, but I'd imagine it would be very, very difficult to coordinate a mass hostage release on the ground if perhaps there are disparate groups that hold them. But clearly, the Curio will have far more information on that than me. But I think it was a concern I would worry about. Um, but yeah, I think it's going to have to be terrain for hostages. That's the only way to do it that I can see.
So explain that. Meaning, when you say terrain for hostages, right now the IDF is kind of controlling 75% of Gaza. But do you mean to actually, declare sovereignty in Gaza and then say, okay, now we're going to give it back? What do you mean by terrain for hostages?
No, so what I would kind of envisage this looking like is you hold the ground and you just let this situation mature. Do the odd strike where you can. If a target pops up, then obviously that can be hit. But you hold what you've got, and we've got two other things that are happening. There's the economic changes that come from aid distribution being removed from Hamas's hands. That needs to continue, and they will continue to lose money, and they will continue to be not able to pay their fighters, and they may themselves eventually run out of food. Who knows? Depending on, of course, how much they've stockpiled. So that's the economic, and then you have the diplomatic lever to pull as well, which is where other clans and tribes are then empowered to kind of control their own little areas of Gaza away from Hamas. And we're seeing that starting in recent weeks. That's something that should be expanded too. So you've got a military holding the ground, you've got diplomatic levers being pulled. Also with Qatar, and the leaders in Doha. You've got economic attacks on Hamas by removing them from aid, and maybe that combination will make them reach a point where they're about to collapse, and then they will trade essentially the hostages for some of what they've lost. Now that doesn't eradicate Hamas, and that's the problem with it. And I think Israel will come to a point where you have to choose hostages or destroy Hamas, because I still don't see a way to achieve both.
Now, at the end of the day, let's say Israel were to try that plan. The second that Hamas releases the last hostage and then gets something in return, they have no longer any leverage, and they're sitting ducks, so to speak. So why would they agree to that plan?
Yeah, and why would they agree to release all of them? Indeed, but any live hostages you can get home is a bonus for me. And the alternative is that you write off the hostages. That's the alternative. And you say, cool, no, 10 million Israelis versus 20 live hostages and 30 dead bodies. We're just going to say, unfortunately, we have to prioritize the long-term security of the country. Unlucky, which is, that's a hell of a conversation for a politician to have to come out and say. And how do you sell that to the Israeli people? It's heartless. And, I don't think it would be political suicide for any politician that came out and said that publicly. So, there are some really hard choices here. And actually, that's a distinguishing feature of the last 21 months is those decisions have been fudged time and time again. People are still talking about achieving both goals. And it's like, as you just correctly pointed out, the odds of every single hostage coming home is minimal at this point, because it would mean Hamas's eventual destruction.
Okay, everyone, that was Andrew Fox from the Henry Jackson Society. And as noted, he pointed out that when he was in Gaza, he heard live fire at the distribution site before the distribution happened. To address that issue, we have Brigadier General Amir Avivi to explain the purpose, the nature of the live fire by the IDF soldiers at the distribution site. General, what can you share with us in terms to make sense of how that works?
Okay. First, there is no Israeli soldiers near areas of distribution. The IDF is not deployed near, because we know that the Gazans will move into these areas, and we don't want to have friction between Israeli soldiers and the Gazans. So we stay far away. What happens is that Hamas tries to create chaos. It tries to create chaos by shooting at Gazans who go there, by sending false messages and saying to them, the distribution is not here, you need to go somewhere else. And then they are sent sometimes to places where soldiers are and not where the distribution is. Now, the situation in Gaza, is very tense. It's a war zone. There is improvised explosive devices and anti-tank missiles and thousands of terrorists. And we have to make sure that the soldiers are safe. So if the soldiers are standing in a position which is not necessarily near at all the distribution area, and suddenly they see a wave of people running towards them, usually what they might do is shoot in the air and stop them and push them back. And only if really somebody gets really near and this endangers the life of the soldiers, they might shoot at him. Now, because it's a war zone and there is chaos and it's very, very dangerous, and almost every day you have soldiers killed, you cannot tell the soldiers behave like it's London or, and as police in a city. It's a war zone. So they have live munition and they have to get ready for any terror encounter. There were, I think, maybe one or two incidents, mostly with reserve units, that they saw a situation of chaos and people running towards them, and they got really nervous. They were sure they are really going to be overrun, and there was specific shooting. And in these cases, the commanders of the command and the division, they brief that, they check, they have lessons learned, but it's not like there is a policy or a tendency to, God forbid, shoot people who are coming to take humanitarian aid. The missions are complicated, and the soldiers are really doing the best they can to really keep their lives and also avoid, hitting people who are civilians and not terrorists.
Brigadier General Amir Avivi, thank you so much for popping in and for providing that much needed clarity and context to what is happening. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you next week, Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.